Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Phoebe Ferguson. I'm a second-year Master's of Environmental Science student in the Biomes Planning Committee. Biomes is YSE's flagship weekly seminar series, bringing cutting-edge research and topics of environmental science to the community. We're always looking for speaker suggestions, so if you have ideas, please share with the Biomes committee member if you have a topic or someone you'd like to see represented here. Following today's talk, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Today's speaker is YSE's own Dr. Eli Fenichel. Dr. Fenichel is the Knobloch Family Professor of Natural Resource Economics here at the Yale School of Environment and an affiliate of the Economic Growth Center. His research approaches natural resource management and sustainability as a portfolio management problem by considering natural resources as a form of capital. His research focuses on how we value and account for natural capital, feedbacks between humans, ecosystems, and management of ecological economic processes, with the interest in how we can and do allocate natural resources and risk across time. Dr. Fenichel's research has been applied over a wide array of different ecological systems. Please give a warm welcome, Dr. Eli.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you all. So a few just public service announcement to start is this is the matinee. For those of you who've noticed, I'm also giving the BAS talk tonight. It's pretty much the same talk. You guys get one extra slide. And so if you're trying to decide how to spend the evening, you're welcome to come, but this is the matinee show. The other thing is I'm gonna go to my slides. So what I want to talk today about is this idea of just connecting the environment and the economy. And I'm going to talk a lot about the work that I got to do over almost 2 years at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, where I was able to use what I had learned doing research and teaching here, interacting with colleagues, to really, I think, make some pretty substantial changes to the way that we connect the environment and the economy in sort of fundamental policy levels. I think many of you have seen a figure that looks something like this notion of the economy being nested inside society, which is nested inside the environment. And this figure is often used to convey what is often promoted as a relatively new idea that like the economy depends on the environment. And this is certainly an important idea. It's hardly new. I was at the University of Illinois a couple weeks ago giving a talk there, and I walked by their agricultural building, and the wealth of Illinois is in her soil. This was carved in the building in 1901. People who know me know I like to talk about Irving Fisher's book, that Nature's Income, the Nature of Capital and Income. And like Irving Fisher was a professor here at the school. He was actually good friends with, not here, he was, I guess, in the econ department. He was actually friends with Gifford Pinchot, and he was a conservationist. And the opening example he gives in this 1906 book of wealth and capital is the Newfoundland fish stocks. And this figure to the left is often associated with this idea of an Anthropocene, this idea of a new geologic period where people are dominating the world. I actually find that I think this figure is actually an old way of thinking, going back, way back to 100 years ago. Really what's going on in the Anthropocene is this idea that these economic decisions that we're making are changing our society and our environment. That we are actually, the environment is no longer, the way we use the word environment actually means the thing in the background, but the environment's no longer in the background. It's part and parcel to the decisions we make every day in our economy. So when we think about discussing our economy, measuring our economy, managing our economy, it also means managing the environment now, not just taking it as an external force pushing in on us. So what is the economy anyway? You might think of different images. You might think of industrial production. You might think of agricultural production. You might think of resource extraction. You might think of a service industry when we think about the economy. And generally speaking, almost every, if you take this to an extreme, every economic action actually does require the environment. If there's human labor involved, presumably people need air quality to be able to breathe and persist. So the question is, how do we actually think about the economy? What does that even mean? And we really didn't talk very much about the economy until we had a way to measure it. And I think most people here have heard of this idea of gross domestic product, or GDP. And it's actually the idea that we're producing a statistic like GDP from a whole set of rich data underneath that allows us to talk about the economy the way we do today. Okay. We use this idea of GDP in some very specific ways, but most commonly, the way most of us know it, is really about providing fabric to weave a social narrative about progress. And many of us who have looked at this go, GDP doesn't seem to align with some of the other signals we're getting, but what's going on here? And I'm going to talk a fair bit about that, so bear with me. One of the things that's interesting is I really like this expression because I think it sets up a better understanding of what GDP is that GDP, it's often said GDP gives a bird's eye view of the economy. And like, why do people say that? Because if you go back, before we had what's called our national accounts, which is the system of accounting that is summarized by GDP, we looked at things like rail car loadings, brassiere sales, all sorts of a smattering of statistics. There was no overarching sort of summary that people could look at. And this was a big problem going into the Great Depression and making economic policy during the Great Depression. And so out of that, we get GDP, and now we're all accustomed to seeing figures that look like this here, which is just some number that's changing over time. And we hear political leaders thinking if GDP goes up, that's a good thing. If GDP goes down, that's a bad thing, blah, 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 right? And most people have no idea what it's actually going on here. So there's this idea that GDP gives a bird's eye view. That is true. Before we had GDP, we could think about economic management as trying to help a blind bird fly around, and it usually crashed into trees, hit the ground, didn't do so well. GDP basically gave us a one-eyed bird. For the, I think, animal behavior people in the room, they all know that birds need stereoscopic vision because they're flying around quickly. And if you cover one eye, you crash into things. Still, you might miss a few of the biggest trees, but like, this isn't great. Way better than being blind, right? So like, progress. So what is GDP? So a caricature of what's going on here is there's a very rich data system that goes into this now, but GDP is really about how much stuff do we make and how much stuff do we consume. And it's about this link between these two boxes here. We might think people care about a lot of stuff, but they certainly care about what they consume. A lot of people have been pulled out of poverty over the last 50, 100 years, and that's important. When we make stuff, we consume some of it. Some of it we throw back into a box we call capital that we use for making more stuff. We use labor to make stuff. And GDP, what it actually feeds into, most importantly, is it feeds into doing things like estimating the potential tax base or forecasting budgets, understanding how stable prices might be through time, things like inflation, thinking about, at the national level, thinking about the creditworthiness of different countries and thinking about sovereign debt. It gets used as we go down this list for like stretching the intended purposes of the way this thing is actually summarized, because people feel like there's not much else. But we've known for over 50 years that this statistic is not sufficient. Even the creators, Simon Kuznets, Elizabeth Jenks and Lillian Epstein, they knew that this was not going to be this, statistic to rule them all. And so we see that many of us are worried about sustainable development. The policy definition for sustainable development is still that the Brundtland Commission put out, which is to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And so I like to think of this as there is a need to think about current production and mobilization for consumption and jobs and the ability for people to consume. That is kind of what GDP does. It doesn't help us at all think about the distribution of real income and equity concerns. And it's not so great at thinking about future opportunities, including those provided by ecosystems. So the framework that's kind of emerged to deal with this is like, let's actually complete this system of national accounting in a richer form with more forms, not just this kind of capital, which is often called produced capital, but we can think about climate, the environment, nature as something called natural capital. And we also care about people, health, and education, which is often called human capital. I have sort of faded this out because as much as I'd love to talk about that, I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to mostly focus on natural capital for this group today. And so this brings to wealth-based accounting approaches that might give us a clear, I mean, I guess what I would say is the goal here is a bird with two eyes. I think where we might be, even as we start to roll these in, these are a bird with two eyes that still needs to go to the optometrist a little bit and wear some glasses, but we're getting better, right? Progress. So if we had a better measurement of the economy as a whole, could we make better economic decisions? And one of the primary tools we use for that is benefit cost analysis. And so what I want to do today for the rest of my talk is I'm going to talk about how some of the work I got to do while I was in the White House helps to make some changes to the way we think about measuring the national economy, to structure those big conversations, as well as feed into some of those other maybe less exciting things that the government has to do, and then how we can think about making better decisions using benefit cost analysis. So GDP is so important, if for no other reason than we see so many narratives crafted around it, right? It might not be the actual details of the number. The precision might not matter so much in the way that it gets used over and over again, because you can't really pick up a newspaper without reading about it. We hear politicians talk about it, and as if, you know, very few people actually know what's in that sausage. But what we do know is there is a long history of people being very worried that we are overly focused on GDP, and its predecessor was GNP, gross national product. So Robert Kennedy famously gave a talk in 1968 in Kansas where he lists all the things, all the weird mismeasured things in GNP, and says like it measures everything in short except that which makes life worth living. Sir Partha Dasgupta recently gave this like wonderful quote about GDP. He says it's like a football team, and he's British, so a soccer team, which measures its success only on the basis of goals it scores, and it doesn't count the goals it concedes. That football team could be losing right through without recognizing it. And what he's referring to here is that GDP doesn't deduct losses or damage or depreciation of capital. It doesn't account for natural capital, and it doesn't account for produced capital. Changes in wealth or would, and it's not just academics like Partha is saying this. We are seeing huge changes across the international community and here in the US in how we think about measuring the economy. So the international standards for producing these national accounts, which lead to GDP, is something called the System of National Accounts. It was last revised in 2008. There's a current revision process going on. Part of that revision process involves public comment. It involves all of you being able to comment on how things like the environment are going to be treated. Those chapters, I understand, are still going to go out for public comment one more time. There's a so if you go to the 2008 version of the System of National Accounts, it says, don't worry about welfare. We're not doing welfare. We're not doing well-being. This is not what this is for. And in the 2025 revision, there will be at least 3 new chapters about how to reorganize the data to think about welfare calculations and to think about well-being and to think about some of these sustainability issues. There's good. I am hearing, and again, I don't know what's going to happen because this isn't settled, that GDP, the recommendations may be to alter the way some calculations in GDP are done to actually account for some natural resource depletion and degradation, which would be actually, there's confusion because then is that still G or is it N as in net? But these are ongoing discussions. So there's real optimism for actually thinking about how this is going to change. Many of you may have seen the UK is really leading on a lot of these efforts with the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. The UN has had a huge what they call Beyond GDP initiative that's really sort of pushing the measurement of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. WEF is involved. Chile this year launched a big natural capital accounting initiative with its finance ministry, central bank, and environment ministry. There have been many African countries, the Australian government, Canada has a new census of the environment run out of its Ministry of Industry. The G7, these are the big major economies forum, multiple times through multiple tracks has doubled down on like saying we need to be thinking about how the environment enters economic measurement through something called the System of Environmental Economic Accounts. This is a daughter program of those System of National Account standards. They are connected. They are meant to work together. We've seen this, the G20, which now includes the African Union, has something called the Data Gaps Initiative that all of their finance ministers have endorsed. And this includes collecting climate emissions data, energy transition data, and there are talks about other natural capital data being included in these sorts of statistics. There are over 90 countries in the world. This map is not completely up to date, but there are over 90 countries in the world that have adopted this system of environmental economic accounts in some form or another, or at least experimenting with it. And if you go look at the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed in Montreal last December, which I actually was one of the US negotiators for, so if you want to hear more about that, we can talk later. It includes thinking about how biodiversity should show up in national accounts. So lots of room for optimism, but if we go and look at what data are actually being produced in the mainline national accounts and reported by OECD countries back to the OECD. So GDP is kind of like a profit, an income statement, okay? And you might expect there to also be a balance sheet, and that system has a balance sheet, but it is seldom completed. I have pulled out the elements that have been included since 1993 in the system of national accounts that we might think of as natural capital in some form. Here, this is the list of resources. It's just small here, and these are all the countries that report to the OECD. There's actually 5 more that I left off that don't report anything. You can see the only country that reports across the board for all of the economy is Australia. Mexico, Canada, Czech Republic, and Japan are all missing at least one sector. The US is at least on the board here, producing land accounts for a sector that what's called the household sector and nonprofits supporting households. And so why is this? Well, you know, there's this idea that maybe natural capital isn't actually important, or maybe it's not important in the sense that it's like perfectly correlated with GDP. And this is what I was actually told when I was in grad school, was like, this is theoretically very interesting. Empirically, it's not super important, okay? And so what I'm showing you here is this is the level of, so the World Bank has been trying to assemble what I'll call like first pass, I don't want to call them crude, but like very preliminary natural capital accounts and human capital accounts for all the countries in the world. That's the blue data. That's the Changing Wealth of Nations report. That's the blue data here. The black data is GDP. This is levels of natural capital. These are changes in natural capital, which is what I think actually the comparison should be. Here, I've added Australia because we had the OECD data, and that's purple. And so what you can see is if you were thinking in levels, if you were thinking in levels right up until I got my PhD, maybe this wasn't such a bad idea for the US, as maybe my advisors were right. But we certainly seem to see divergence after that. And for Australia, I don't even know what to make out of these figures. We really can't answer this question. And if you look at changes in natural capital related to GDP, neither one explains much variation in the other. And there's a number of reasons. It could be that they don't matter. It could be that GDP is leaving out important things. And it could be like the natural capital measurement is getting assumed into other measurements. So what we're getting is actual residual error here. We don't know, but it seems high time we figure this out. So enter the US now has a strategy to do this. Last Earth Day 2022, Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo announced that the US will begin doing natural capital accounts and have a standardized set of environmental economic statistics. She promised a strategy by the end of the year, and then in 2023, the US government would start implementing that strategy. Now, it's important that Secretary Raimondo said this, as she is the Secretary for Commerce, and Commerce oversees 2 of the principal statistical agencies, the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Census Bureau. It also oversees NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which leads a lot of US work on climate change. So I think we met this deadline. Secretary Kerry announced a finalized report that had gone through a peer review process, or a public comment process in January, which I will call by the end of the year by government standards, in Davos. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about what's in, how this came about and what's in it, and then we'll pivot to talking about benefit cost analysis. So people often ask me, like, why did this happen? How did this come about? How did we get here in the US? And of course, I've already told you about Irving Fisher and Gifford Pinchot, and they were both advisors to Teddy Roosevelt. So I think many people in our school have seen this. The nation behaves well if it treats natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value. And I've heard many people say, oh, he was talking metaphorically. No, he was talking literally. And my read on this is he's being advised by Gifford Pinchot and Irving Fisher. He probably meant this literally, given the two of their writings. Some interesting things happen in this little squiggle that are like important, but like I couldn't fit them on the slide. In 1934, Kuznets, Epstein, and Jenks developed the first what I'll call pilot or experimental national income and product account and presented to the US Senate. In 1940, I will say Keynes hijacks some of Kuznets' ideas and says, this is how we pay for World War II. And it actually, I think, undermines some of the welfare interpretations that Kuznets actually had in mind. In 1947, the US gets its first national income and product accounts, which lead to the first GNP, which is what becomes GDP. Interestingly, in 1948, the Oxford English Dictionary says that environment enters the English language in the ecological sense that we use it today. Before that, it really just meant like what was around you. And then what we see in the 1960s is things like the Robert Kennedy quote and a whole bunch of, environment, the whole environmental movement sort of questioning is growth a good thing? Is like what's going on here? And so Bill Nordhaus and James Tobin, professors here at Yale, wrote this really influential paper in 1972, published it in 1973, called Is Growth Obsolete? And we just had a 50th anniversary conference for this last week. And it was interesting to hear Bill talk about, like, he basically was saying, like, oh, wait, so he had read an article where someone called GNP, gross national pollution. And like, is that like really what's going on? And decided to dig in and try and figure out what's getting measured and what's not. And I would say the punchline from this paper is that they basically say the concept of growth is probably a good thing, but it's growth of what? There are other, and they say in the paper, there are other serious consequences to treating as free things which are not really free. This practice gives the wrong signals of the direction of economic growth. And this is a really interesting paper. He talks about climate change in this paper and is really, and interdisciplinary collaboration. This leads to a whole bunch of economic research by people like Marty Weitzman, Robert Solow, Jeff Heel, Partha Dasgupta, and many others, and ultimately leads into the early 90s with the system of national accounts bringing on those natural capital elements I showed you before into the balance sheet, the start of the system of environmental economic accounting, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis here in the US starting an integrated environmental economic satellite account. And now when national statisticians say satellite, they don't mean things up in the sky. They just mean things that are kind of not in the main core of their accounts, but are related to on the outside. Unfortunately for all of us is some folks, some Congress people from Kentucky and West Virginia were not super thrilled with this initiative, and they organized Congress to say, please stop doing this to the Commerce Department. We would like you to go get a peer review of your methods before you continue, and we're going to give you, I believe it's $400,000 to go do that. Commerce turns around and they get Bill Nordhaus to lead this effort, which becomes this publication, Nature's Numbers, that doesn't get published until 1999. This is basically the peer review report of BEA's methods. It's actually very positive on what BEA was doing. It makes some recommendations to do a few things a little bit differently around the edges, but it's overwhelmingly positive on the core. Interestingly, what happens in the interim is in 1995, Congress passes the Paperwork Reduction Act that we all like to make fun of because there's like 3 more sheets on the end of every government form because of it. But the Paperwork Reduction Act also overhauled the statistical community in the US. It created the modern office of the chief statistician, which sits in the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. And her job is to coordinate across what we have as an incredibly sprawling statistical system in the US. There are 13 principal statistical agencies. There are over 100 statistical programs. And basically, the Paperwork Reduction Act gave her the authority to coordinate the kind of work BEA was doing on the integrated environmental economic satellite account. So that's kind of positive. It just bumps along. We go into the 2000s, and we see just a slew of reports from the national academies, from the National Bureau of Economic Research, from the Government Accountability Office, all saying we really do need some form of environmental economic accounting to understand how the environment and the economy are interacted at sort of these big scales. We're not quite sure how to summarize it. There was a big thing about green GDP and should we green GDP or not. That's really sort of besides the point. They all were saying we need this sort of the underlying data structures to talk to each other. We study the international community adopts what's called the SIA Central Framework as an international standard in 2012. Throughout this time, lots of other countries are rolling out natural capital accounts. The UK has an experiment, a full natural capital account as an official experimental statistic in their blue book, which is their official statistics now. And then in 2019, Congress passes the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. This is an act written by Paul Ryan, signed by President Trump. And in that piece of legislation, it says the purpose of the statistical community is to create statistics related to the economy, health, blah, 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 and the natural environment. So aside from, I believe the first time saying the statistical community actually is supposed to be paying attention to the natural environment, it also gives even more authorities to the chief statistician to coordinate these kinds of efforts. And then we get ecosystem accounting out of SIA and the US national strategy. The US strategy, it's about a 100-page document, but it's 100 pages of bullet points because that's how I learned to write when I was in government. And so it's 100 pages of bullet points, and there's 5 big bullet points or 5 main bullet points. The first is to be pragmatic. So while we can talk about liking these statistics as like overarching material to craft this narrative about how we're doing, it also has to plug into very specific decision-making contexts. And so the strategy lays out some cases where that might be true. Here, the letters are showing some of those. It says this needs to be done year over year. It needs to create time series. Statistics are not useful if we just do them as a one-shot deal. And we also need to pay attention to be able to harmonize these with the international community. The third recommendation, and it sort of lays some of those details out. The third recommendation is that it should be part of the US economic statistical system. It shouldn't be something off on its side. It needs to integrate with these national income and product accounts. It should use the SIA, which is sort of the international standards. I think one of the big contributions it makes is it says we should use a few accounting boundaries. So since the dawn of national income and product accounting, going back to the 1930s, the debate has always been what's in and what's out. This is called the accounting boundary. What this strategy says is like we don't need to do just one. We can't do too many, but we can probably pick a small number of useful ones. And I'll say a few more words about that because I'm pretty excited about this recommendation. It says to use best available economics and science. And then the fourth recommendation is actually the strategy, which is a 15-year phased approach and I'll show you what's in there in a moment. With pilot accounts, the first step of these. So what is an official statistic? If you've ever seen a government scientists give a talk, they always have a disclaimer at the beginning that says, I'm not talking for the government, and blah, 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 blah. An official statistic means they don't have to make that disclaimer. It means that these are the actual data that the government says are, dare I say, truth, right? And that, so like if a government scientist shows you GDP, they don't have to give you a disclaimer just to talk about the GDP. Pilot accounts are not that, but it's the first step on the process to that. It's going to provide a new summary of change in wealth of natural capital, provide dashboards at the physical or biological level as well as the monetary level. And then the fifth recommendation actually goes through what authorities and what structures enable this to happen. So accounting boundaries real quick. The first thing was just do what's in the system of national accounts. Let's get more green dots on that chart that I showed you a bit before. Do what we're supposed to be doing. We're not doing it now. Let's get that up and running. This is really important. Getting GDP right is pretty important for short-term budget forecasting for the federal government. Is kind of a key use there. However, there's been a long discussion about what's called defensive expenditures, and this was originally in the context of how do we think about national defense, the Army. But as we think about things like climate change and whether they're wetlands or forests or sort of our natural assets are important buffers, right? And they provide a lot of storm protection. So that's a form of defensive expenditure. So how do we include those? These have long been discussed in and out, depending on who was leading the charge intellectually. So just do another boundary with that and we can compare. And then there's another area called household produced services that's also almost as old. It's mostly associated with the challenges of accounting for caring for one's own kids, cooking and cleaning meals, providing services within the household that are often outside the GDP boundary. They account for about, BEA estimates they account for about 23% of GDP. Like the value of them is at least around the order of magnitude is 23% of GDP, or about a quarter of the size of our economy. I think that's an underestimate personally. But recreational services or leisure services from nature would fall in there as well. So I'm just going to show you guys this to show you, I love this figure. This actually walks you through how you think about these different boundaries. So I would encourage people to go to the strategy. I'm going to leave time for questions rather than walk you through this. But I would encourage people who are interested in these to actually go pull up the strategy and look at this figure, because this is adapted from the OECD, and I think it really helps. I want to show you what's in the strategy. So there's 2 pages of Gantt chart in the national strategy as well. And some things in green were things that were kind of already going on that are being subsumed into the national strategy or aligned with the national strategy. One is having a net domestic product that will actually include depreciation of natural assets. I think we'll probably see that actually we'll start to see that reasonably quickly, I think. A satellite account on damages from natural hazards and climate events are some of the things in here. So there's this is supporting products and summaries, but we're already starting to see some of these pilot accounts come out. BEA has produced a pilot air emissions account. It's produced a pilot land account, and it's produced what they call the environmental activities and jobs account. Now, most of these are using Eurostat methodologies, and a lot of the main point is, okay, what do we tried this doing Eurostat's methodology. What do we have to do differently to make it work in the US? So it's a pilot. And what you see here is basically the run is it takes about 6 years from the time they do pilots to experimental accounts. Here it is down here, to where they think they can get to official statistics if they're producing these approximately annually. There's more stuff that's being produced. We're already sort of seeing work on some of these second phase accounts like minerals and energy and forests. Forest Service has put out a paper on a forest account plan. We're starting to see work on non-traditional geologic assets. This is basically wind and solar power. And we're seeing a lot of work starting to get moving on how do you develop a classification system and taxonomy? How do you develop evaluation standards that work? And we're seeing great international engagement. So the US has signed a joint agreement with Australia to collaborate on this project. So let me I said that we need to balance sort of this narrative telling use with the sort of more mundane, what I'll call more mundane uses, or where do these actually plug into policy? And I want to focus on cases outside benefit cost, and then I will pivot to benefit cost analysis, because most people's mind seems to go to benefit cost first. So I think one is it will improve federal budget forecasts, particularly the long-term forecast. We know that climate events, changes in natural resources are big expenditures for the federal government, and they affect the tax revenue that can come in. A colleague of mine was in the White House described the federal government as really just our biggest insurance company. And that seems to be like pretty apt when you think about climate, right? That's actually a pretty good description. And it doesn't have the balance sheet. All people who do regional planning, regional development often use this thing called IMPLAN or other regional input-output models. Those all pull data from our national accounts. And then what they do right now is they clam on this other like unassociated environmental data if they do anything. But this would provide a link to make those regional planning models more streamlined. There's also, I think, what we see in the private sector that's trying to do ESG type accounting is this attempt to sort of who's going first, national accounts or private accounts, national accounts or private accounts. And I think some of the taxonomies and some of the classification regimes and some of the rules for processes are going to they're going to become complementary and they're going to work together. I also think trade is a big issue. We're seeing more and more trade agreements, whether it's the global agreement on aluminum and steel tariffs, which is basically a carbon-linked tariff, the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe, the global agreement on plastics, linking trade agreements to environmental data. Now, in order for those to actually get the environmental benefit or environmental outcomes, in order for those to actually work as economic trade agreements, there needs to be real data underpinning them and statistics that align with the industrial sectors that are supposed to be implicated in these trade agreements. And that's part of what this does, is it lets them be credible and sort of high quality. And what I like to say too is I'm willing to start a betting pool of when we start seeing the biodiversity border adjustment mechanism, because it seems that biodiversity just follows climate by like 5 or 6 years. So now that Europe's doing a carbon border adjustment, I think they'll do a biodiversity border adjustment soon. We're also, I think, seeing this in sort of sovereign debt markets. Maybe we'd see this someday in municipal debt markets here in the US. The IMF is very concerned. This is a figure they put out in 2018, looking at Kazakhstan and like Kazakhstan's net operating balance with and without deductions for natural capital or natural resources. You might not have thought Kazakhstan was a great investment to begin with, but when you think about deduction losses of natural resources, it looks even worse. We're also seeing things like debt for nature swaps and other sort of big, in order for these to be credible and work, I think we need this sort of accounting. So the future looks more like a dashboard of a few big indicators rather than just GDP. Let me pivot for a few minutes, and then I'll try and go through this quickly. The other big thing that I got to work on while I was at the White House was adjusting and modernizing the way that we do benefit cost analysis. So it turns out our national accounts data is not typically used in benefit cost analysis for most cases. How that scheme I just showed you will be is still to be determined, but we've also made some tweaks and a modernization to the way benefit cost analysis is done. So what is this? So when the government wants to do something, if it wants to regulate something, it does regulatory analysis. If it wants a big program, it also has to do benefit cost analysis. I'm gonna focus on regulation right now. Here's a regulation that I just pulled from the Federal Register. If you want to know what's going on, go look at the Federal Register. And what they basically have to do is they have to figure out the benefits and costs. They have to figure out what's going to happen with and without a new rule or regulation. They have to sort of model that out, sum up the benefits and costs. They need to describe the setting. They need to document the numbers. They're going to go through some sort of public comment. They need to respond, adjust those numbers, and basically do a benefit cost analysis. Unfortunately, this is like the best example I could find in like 10 minutes of searching of like clarity in the Federal Register. They're not always very clearly written, but you get tables of like, here's the benefits of mostly methane reduction in this rule, compliance costs, and then a whole bunch of non-monetary benefits like visibility benefit, reducing vegetation effects from ozone, some health benefits, like they get sort of glommed in. So in the first day of his presidency, President Biden asked his administration to modernize the process for doing regulatory analysis. And that resulted just last week in the finalization of some of those documents. The most important one is probably this document horribly named Circular A4. Circulars are like the highest level guidance that the Office of Management and Budget puts out. And this tells agencies how to go through and do that benefit cost analysis they have to do on every regulation. Now, they were always supposed to consider the environment and things like that, but it was never there explicitly. It was sort of like an interpretation. The new version has an explicit section on accounting for benefits and costs from environmental services, ecosystem services, and natural capital. It's explicitly spelled out. I think it appears 18 times. Ecosystem services appear, I think, 18 times in the new document. There's also a new section on health and environmental impacts on communities with environmental justice concerns. Right? These things are spelled out explicitly now. The document's much longer. I say this is like actually not having IKEA instructions, but actually good instructions for putting your furniture together. And so I would encourage people to take a look through because I think there's a lot in there that can be helpful to think about where research can plug into policy. There's another document that guides all the other benefit cost analyses that the government does that has been aligned with A4. This is called A94, Circular A94, another very creative name. And this also calls out ecosystem services and environmental services. Both these documents kick to a new guidance document that we got to work on, which is the first ever time that the government's issuing guidance for assessing changes in the environment and ecosystem services and benefit cost analysis. And this is also a very exciting document, which has not quite been finalized yet, but I am confident it will be soon. So the highlights from all of this, if you know what welfare-based means, it's all welfare-based. If you don't know what it means, don't worry about it. They are all aligned with each another. They are cross-referencing. We used to have two actually different regimes of benefit cost, and it was a bit confusing. They pretty much defer to each other, and they're very explicit when they don't agree between A4 and A94. There's a whole bunch of new things that economists might be interested in related to, could you ever think of using willingness to accept instead of willingness to pay? Can we use revealed preference or stated preference data? The new discount rate is 2%. It was effectively used to be 7%. That is a huge change. And the ecosystem service guidance actually goes through and walks through all these kinds of regulations that might implicate ecosystem services. It says, really what you need to do is you need to think about the regulatory change and an effect to a social system, the built system, or the natural system could implicate ecosystem services. It walks through how you think about getting to whether you monetize, quantify, or describe benefits. And it really pushes and provides approaches to get to monetization. You might not love monetization, but when things are not monetized, they are effectively treated as zero in these analyses. And so what that means is that lots of this stuff here will get monetized. We may also find new costs, right? So it's not always going to be that the environment wins out. We might discover there's new costs as well as benefits. And these guidances are very clear on that. And so a colleague of mine who was at OMB while we were working on this together, we wrote this op-ed that pointed out none of this is really about the environment per se. It's really about better government and more accurate analysis around these hard to do things that we're asking government to do over and over again. So with that, what I'm going to say is that a lot's been done over the last 2 years. There really has been a lot done, and I'm pretty excited about it. There's a bunch of new institutional structures to help us stop treating the environment as if it were free while ensuring positive real economic growth. And I think this will benefit from engagements from academics and students. It's going to create opportunities to shape new amazing data sets that we'll have to work with. There's even more reason for us to be engaging interdisciplinarily, which we are good at here. I will say for the economists, we need to think beyond just benefit cost is important, but we need to think beyond benefit cost analysis. And I think all of us need to do a better job thinking about how do we make our studies scalable and replicable in space and time, because I think that's what's needed for these sorts of, that's what these institutional changes in the way we think about the environment and the economy together really need. And hey, that's good for us because these are all things we're trying to do at YSE. So with that, I'm going to try and stop and leave a little bit of time for questions.
Any questions?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious, and you may have been kind of alluding to this or speaking to it, so maybe just double clicking on some stuff you've already talked about. The math that underlies a lot of our measurement of environmental happiness, wellness kind of metrics. I come from a greenhouse gas accounting background, so GHGP, kind of ISO, all of those, they're changing very rapidly and they are very fuzzy. Economists tend to like very pretty models that are clean. So I'm curious how those two are kind of playing together in this space.
Yeah, so this is part of the reason why, at least for the national strategy, you see those 6-year run times from the time that they're supposed to be getting the pilots up to going through a 3-year piloting period to a 3-year experimenting period before they get to official statistics. I think for some of those, for like the land accounts, I think that's actually pretty reasonable, and they might even be able to do it faster. For some things, it might be a little bit slower. I think the problem right now is part of the reason that we see this stuff all over the map is there are not agreed standards. There are not like the taxonomy. Everybody's coming up with their own taxonomies. Everybody's trying to get to the absolute best rather than what's workable. And if you go back and look at the history, like the first set of national income and products accounts, it wasn't great. You know what? If you rip off like the covers now, we cringe at a lot of the things that are done in our national accounts today. They just become sort of the norm and people keep doing them, and they do, at least they're doing the same thing consistently through time. And I think we need to like just suck it up and do the same thing around the environment, and we can improve. GDP has been revised many, many times over its history. I remember in the like around 2013, like they did this big thing with Star Wars because they started counting books and movies and whatnot as capital. And before that, like artistic originals and movies and things were not. And I just remember these Star Wars posters because Star Wars was published, Star Wars, 1976, right? Is still making a lot of money for Disney. So it's certainly a capital asset. And I think these things change over time, and that's okay. It's not a reason not to like start getting the organizational stuff together. I can hear you.
There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to connect your last point on that slide with actually one of the first points in the talk, which was the bird's eye view. And I'm one of those animal behaviors you were talking about. I would like you to help me understand or more share, how do you see the attempt at scalability and replicability for measure and evaluation that I'm assuming you mean we are going to need more work done at a smaller scale on the ground. Implicit, I assume, in all of your talk is that so much of this is going to move fast, and it's possible because of this big data revolution we're all seeing. Are you getting at the need that we will have to scale down to validate what big data is going to be telling us on all this? And if so, because of my personal interest that I want to share with you later, are you, when you're thinking scale, are you thinking of example, for my own sake, ranches in Argentina, where we can really engage the owners and the companies to make them aware of the natural capital they have, hoping that we can scale up from that?
Yeah.
Would that be something that you fits in your last point there?
So I think there's a couple things to understand. Is like when we put together GDP right now, the BEA gets summarized data from the tax statistics, and they can cut those any which way they want. When they built the first marine economy satellite accounts for the US, there was a big debate of, do you count coffee shops 1 kilometer or 5 kilometers from the coast? Like, that's the resolution of the economic data they're already using. The environmental data is getting there super fast, right? So there is some of that scaling up and scaling down. One of the big things I kept hearing, and one of the reasons that people are really nervous about meeting some of these timelines, is for a national environmental economic account, the data needs to be national. We've got pretty good data for most of these things today for the contiguous United States. Alaska and Hawaii don't have as good of data. And then you start talking about Puerto Rico and other overseas territories, and the data go down even further. So there are these issues where some of the data, we just have data holes. There are really good data in metropolitan areas on some things, but not so good in rural areas. And so part of this is, can you take the methods we're developing and actually use them across, or can we develop a set of methods that can cover the US? And are these methods that can be done over and over again without basically creating a full employment program for YSE graduates, right? And so we need you guys to do other things than work on this. So the idea is like really thinking, I think we have a job that I never thought I would say this, and I apologize if anyone's offended by this, but I never thought I'd have to think like an engineer, where it's like, no, I'm just going to do science and create great stuff, where the engineers then go, okay, I'm going to create something great, but how do I move it into production? How do I move it into market? Right. And I think we need to think more about that with our environmental data, with our environmental economic data, with the kinds of work we're doing, so that it can be picked up and repeated. And so what we're finding more and more, one of the big things that I think the federal government's going to have to grapple with is, we think of the federal government as being this giant data provider, but we're also seeing the federal government being increasingly a data consumer. And what's going to be the balance in the future of US government science that's generated by US government scientists, and what's going to be like the balance that's bought from someplace like Planet Labs, right? And so I think these are all related to your question. I don't know if I answered it exactly. I don't know about ranches in Argentina. Do we have time for one more?
Building on the last question, what are some good examples of operationalizing natural asset accounting? Again, trying to find that balance, like top down versus bottom up. And do you have any commentary on Canada's municipal natural asset accounting that's emerging?
Okay, so what was the first part of the question? Let me try and do that one first.
What are some good examples of operationalizing?
Operationalizing. So I think there've been, so the UK has a bunch of neat examples. If you go on and look at some of their dashboards, and they look at sustainable management of fisheries, and how like their sustainably managed fisheries are growing and their unsustainably managed fisheries are shrinking. They have some really cool work on urban air quality and I think leisure and like the value added, and they're able to connect that, I think, to some of the tax revenues now that they're starting to see and whatnot. New Zealand has a really cool, so New Zealand manages most of its fisheries with a tradable permit system. And so New Zealand has been, so it actually turns out the example in the system of national accounts for an uncultivated biological asset are managed fisheries inside a country's EEZ. And New Zealand has been experimenting with using the data from its tradable permit system to think about how that's bolstering its balance sheet. So where are we seeing this? We're all then seeing some of the countries that are running ahead in Africa on this that have been working with places like the World Bank, actually taking these natural capital accounts to sovereign debt markets, to really funders, not so much the open sovereign debt market. And so it's a little bit like they're going back to the World Bank who helped them produce this and saying, can we get a slightly better loan? Because look, we're also bolstered by our natural capital. And I think these are some of the like what we're starting to see come out. I am thrilled. I talked to people a couple of years ago about the municipal natural capital accounting in Canada. I didn't know they had moved forward with it. I actually think this is a huge open area that I am excited to start like to dig into. I don't know a ton about municipal bond markets, but I have a real suspicion that as we face climate change and we face increasing natural disasters, that municipalities that can put together natural capital accounts will be able to get better, better debt issuances, lower borrowing rates, not free, but they might get an eighth of a point deduction or a quarter point deduction. And that can be really important for the people living in those communities. And that will help create incentives for them to invest in this natural capital. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I think we have time for about one more question.
I have two quick questions. Thanks. That was a great talk. I wonder first, the White House launched the National Nature Assessment just this year, and to what extent you think that will be useful in this? And then the second question is, why is the U.S. so bad? And like, what's the pushback that you anticipate potentially happening with this new?
Yeah. So National Nature Assessment, yes, actually, if you read the documents for it, the idea is the National Nature Assessment to be every 4 or 5 years. I can't remember right now. And the idea is when you produce statistics, you need the best available science. That doesn't always mean cutting edge. The National Nature Assessment will be able to use cutting edge science and basically be the like pushback and how do you update and modernize, is kind of at least how we were envisioning it when I was there. And it's, I think, kind of what's written in the National Nature Strategy. I also point out, if you weren't paying attention, the National Climate Assessment just came out yesterday. So if you haven't paid attention to that, go read it. It's like a great document. Sorry that you reminded me that I wanted to say that. Why is the US so bad? The US was really ahead of the curve in the 1990s, right? With the BEA's efforts. We got hamstrung by Congress at that time to do things officially. We have had excellent government scientists working on like little research projects here and there. That's a problem, right? It's good that we have the expertise. They have never had a way to funnel that up and go beyond just doing the research. So it's turned out that like USGS has been a big supporter of the development of natural capital accounts around the world, just not here. DEA, same thing, because they have the expertise, but they hadn't had the sort of and then like Canada has an agency called Statistics Canada. It's in the Ministry of Industry, but it's fairly autonomous. They have like natural scientists, social scientists, everyone's like in this one ministry, and they have a whole environmental statistics group. It's like 9 or 10 people, but it's a whole group. The US has 13 principal statistical agencies. And the number one thing I learned when we talk about the federal government, we're not referring to the Federation of States, we're referring to the Federation of Agencies. Okay. And so part of it is just our structure of being this very federated society and having the expertise spread out all over. But what I will tell you is, if you read the national strategy, there were 27 agencies and offices involved with it. They were not hard to recruit. I had, deputy secretaries from the Department of Defense calling us up and saying, can we be part of this? Okay. So I actually think that institutionally, there's been a lot of longing for this. It had been one of these things that was hard to get coordinated. And I will say, when Janet Yellen was here a few months ago now, And I was talking to Janet about this, and she looked at me and said, wait, didn't we fix this when I was at CEA in the 1990s? So I think the other problem is people don't, this is like one of those things of it's like it's an unknown thing that people haven't realized we've really been missing, except in very wonky quarters, which wasn't sufficient to get this up to the level of coordination that was needed. I will also say that my second day on the job, Secretary Raimondo sent two of her senior advisors to talk to me, and they came in and said, Secretary wants to do something like green GDP and environmental economics. So this is not just like, I think it was just time for the US. And I wish we weren't so far behind, but I actually think we have a lot of the capacity now that we're getting organized. I think it's also important for us to like continue asking about it and start creating, making sure that there's still demand, because like if you think about what people who study labor can do, or people who study what the macroeconomy can do with the types of statistics that the government produces, like 10, 15, 20 years, 25 years, we'll be able to do that in the environment. And that'll be super cool.